Well, good morning. If that does not get your blood moving a little bit, you've got a problem. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. George Hillman, Vice President for Education and Professor of Educational Ministries and Leadership at Dallas Theological Seminary. George came to DTS with years of pastoral experience in churches and parachurch organizations in Texas and Georgia. He is a graduate of Texas A&M. We're going to try that again. You got to keep that tradition alive. A graduate of Texas A&M, a little better. Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. George has a passion for education, spiritual formation, and leadership development. He is a rabid college football fan. And if you didn't know this, he loves very good barbecue. He's married to his wife, Jana, and they have one grown daughter who is in Italy pursuing a career in the arts. George, it is a privilege and an honor to work with you, to have you on campus, to watch you use the gifts that the Lord has given you. And thank you for making Dallas Seminary a better place because of your presence, because of your love for the Lord. So, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. George Hillman today?
If you were here the last time I preached, I had a baby Yoda, and I've had stuffed animals, and I've decided to upgrade to weaponry, I guess, in the midst of all this. We'll get to this in just a second. If you had the privilege of living in Texas in February, you got to experience the Ice-Mageddon. $200 billion in damage across the United States. Lives were lost. Many of you had no power, had no water. At the Hillman house, we were fortunate. No one died. We had power the entire time. We had water the entire time. But the casualty at the Hillman house was I lost all 13 bushes in my front yard. And I thought, well, they're going to grow back. And so we trimmed them, got rid of the dead stuff. We said, they're got to come back. Well, after about a month, we said, this isn't happening. And so I thought to myself, 13 bushes. I'll go out one Saturday morning and I'll just knock this out. I'll get these bushes taken care of and we'll plant new bushes. Maybe we'll have time in the afternoon to go buy the new bushes and to get that done. Well, we have lived in our house for 23 years. And those bushes have been in front of my house for 23 years. So I get my tools out. I get a shovel, I get a pickaxe, and I start digging a trench around. And I think I can just dig a trench around, and these are bound to be able to pop up. I think the horticultural term is gnarly. I had gnarly roots. Roots on top of roots, roots underneath the roots. And it didn't matter how much I dug, those things were not budging. So what I thought I would do all 13 bushes in a Saturday, I got 2 bushes done. And what I thought was going to be one Saturday morning turned into 5 Saturdays. Oh, it became the entertainment of our neighborhood. Every Saturday morning, what's George doing? The neighbors have coming out. Hey, buddy, how's those bushes going? It got desperate around my house. And if you go to YouTube and you look up bush removal, what you're going to see is videos of people with pickup trucks and chains. And they wrap the chains around the bushes and they wrap the chains around the pickup trucks and they're pulling the bushes out. I could not convince my wife to get our Honda HR-V to get a chain behind it to pull the bushes out. But it was 5 weeks to get my bushes pulled out. And every Monday, that was the conversation in the office. What'd you do this weekend? Oh, it was the bushes again, those types of things. Because well-established things are not easily moved. Well-established things that are rooted, things that are grounded, they are not easily moved. And it doesn't matter what tool you have, it's not budging. And that's going to bring us to our passage today. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 6. And I want you to have the passage in front of you. So pull out that phone, pull out that iPad, get that old Bible. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 6, and we're going to look at 2 verses, 19 and 20. I'm going to read the passage to you, then I'm going to tell you how we get to this passage, and then we're going to unpack the passage. So we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. Let me just read the passage to you. It says, "We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, if you know the book of Hebrews, those two verses, pretty much that's the entire book of Hebrews unpacked there. Let me kind of get you where we get to this point in the book of Hebrews that we start having this discussion. So the book of Hebrews is written to believers in Jesus who have come out of the Jewish synagogue. And they have given up everything to follow Jesus. They have given up family relationships. They've given up societal security. They've left the synagogue, and now they are followers of Jesus. But then what's happening simultaneously is that persecution is starting to happen among the believers from the Roman officials. So you've got the synagogue, they've been disowned by those individuals, and now there's persecution happening from the Roman officials. And so you have these believers, and they're wondering, is it safer to go back? At least when we went back, we weren't being persecuted by the Romans. We were recognized as Jewish, and we were not being persecuted. And so is it safer to go back? Because things started getting a little shaky. And there's two audiences. As you read the book of Hebrews, there's two audiences. One is to encourage the faithful. And you're going to see throughout the book of Hebrews this phrase, let us. Let us. All throughout the book. Because for you who are being faithful to Jesus, let us be all in this together. But then there's also a warning to those who are window shopping. A warning to those who are test driving Jesus. Now, maybe they followed the crowds to come into the church, but they haven't gone all in yet in faith. And so you have both things happening simultaneously. You have encouragement to the faithful. Let us keep with this. And then you also have these warning passages to the window shoppers. As you know, throughout the book of Hebrews, there is a sequence that goes there about Jesus is superior. Jesus is superior to the angels. Jesus is superior to Moses. Jesus is superior to the high priest. Jesus is superior to the covenant, to the tabernacle, and to the sacrifice. Jesus is better in all of those different things. And all throughout the book, that's what you see the author doing. Well, you get to chapter 5, and he's wanting to make this transition, and he wants to talk about Melchizedek. And you get to middle of chapter 5, and he says, I'm getting ready to blow your mind that Jesus is better than the priesthood of Aaron. And he gets ready to go there. But then he realizes this might be too much for the audience. And so starting in 5:11 all the way through the end of chapter 6, there is a providential detour where he takes a time, he says, before I blow your mind and tell you about how Jesus is a superior priest, I want to make sure that you're on board with me, that you're still sticking with me. So it's kind of a pause. If you've ever had a conversation with somebody and you're going with this conversation, about halfway through the conversation, you want to say, I want to make sure, are you still sticking with me? Are you still okay with what I'm saying? That's exactly what's happening from 5:11 to the end of chapter 6. So Melchizedek. Now again, we're a seminary, so this name doesn't completely throw you off. We hear about him in Genesis 14, where Abraham is coming back from victory on the battlefield, and Abraham gives a tenth, a tithe, to this mysterious, righteous priest king named Melchizedek. And then in Psalm 110, there's a prophecy saying that there's going to be another priest that's going to come, not in the line of Aaron, but in the line of Melchizedek. And when you read that psalm and then you go and then read Hebrews, you start realizing the author of Hebrews is sprinkling Psalm 110 all throughout the book, that there's something coming and it's going to be better. It's going to be superior to what you've ever experienced before. We've just sung about faith. He's asking these people to take the plunge. Do I really trust that Jesus can hold me? Do I really trust before I jump all the way in that Jesus can hold me? And I'm going to give up the old sacrificial system. I'm going to give up the old priesthood. Boy, Jesus has better catch me because I'm getting ready to leap in with faith. It's like my daughter who's on the edge of the pool, when she was little. And she's got her swimsuit on, she's got her goggles on. She might even dip her toe in the water. And I'm in the water and I'm saying, honey, I've got you, jump in. But you're not swimming until you take the plunge, until you jump in. And the author of Hebrews is saying, Jesus has got you. Jesus is going to be there to catch you. Trust him as you go completely in. So there's this image of Melchizedek, and then he talks about Abraham. If you've got your passage in front of you, you see that just a couple verses above, starting in verse 13, he starts talking about Abraham. Now you know that Abraham is always the trump card. Paul's going along, he says, I want to talk about how it is righteousness that comes by faith and not by works. Abraham, boom, and that kind of ends the conversation. Same thing happens in the book of Hebrews. He's going along saying, you're getting ready to take this plunge. I'm getting ready to pull the trump card out, and the trump card is Abraham. So if you got the passage in front of you, let's look at verses 13 through 18 that gets us to where our passage is for today. Hebrews 6:13 says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom he could swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, that by two unchangeable things, that's the promise and the oath, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that is set before us. The author is saying, I'm going to ask you to take a plunge. I'm going to ask you to give up your old ways and to go with something new, something that's mind-blowing, something you've never heard of before. And Abraham did it. Abraham was not trusting in the law because the law wasn't even in existence yet. Abraham was not trusting in the priesthood of Aaron because Aaron hadn't even been born yet. It was by faith. And the author says, I'm asking you to take this plunge of faith. And at the end of the passage, we get back in the story. See, he takes this detour starting in 5:11, and he talks about Melchizedek, and he talks about Abraham, and then he comes back to us, and he says, the hearers at that time, but then also you and me, we are heirs of the promise. We are heirs of the promise. And so that brings us to our passage again. Let me read it to you again. Hebrews 6:19 and 20. We, you, me, all of us, we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. There's three images. There's a nautical image, there's a temple image, and there is a military image. I didn't bring the pickaxe just to bring it up here. Here's our nautical image. It's that of an anchor. And it says the anchor is two things. It says the anchor is sure and the anchor is steadfast. Well, what does sure and steadfast mean? Sure means that the anchor is not going to break. It's not going to rust. It's not going to dissolve. The anchor is solid. On my pickaxe, if you came up and looked at my pickaxe, you would see that it is a well-loved pickaxe. This pickaxe is going to fail you in two ways. It's either going to slip out of the head, that's why I've got wedges in there to keep it tight, or it's going to break at the neck. So if I'm using my pickaxe and I'm trying to remove my 23-year-old bushes and the handle fails, this is absolutely and totally useless. An anchor that breaks is useless. But Jesus doesn't break. It doesn't matter how hard I push on Jesus. He's going to hold firm because he is sure. But he's also steadfast. So I get my pickaxe, I've got my bush, I'm working around my bush, and as you're working out in the yard, it gets muddy after a while. And there got to a point where I wasn't able to get good traction, couldn't get the leverage to pull up. So if I've got this thing, and even though it's not going to break, and I have nothing to latch it onto, and I can't get a good grip to pull it back, then it slips. Anchors are useless if they slip. So this is an anchor that is sure. It is not going to break. It does not matter how hard you push on the anchor. It is not going to slip. This anchor is steadfast. It doesn't matter how hard you pull back. It is not going to slip. And that's what Jesus is. These believers are standing on the edge and they're like, can we completely trust Jesus? And the author says, absolutely, completely trust Jesus because he is sure and he is steadfast. That brings us to the second image, which is the image of the temple. Again, our passage says we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that is entered into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone. If you continue reading on in the book of Hebrews in chapters 8, 9, and 10, the author goes into great detail describing temple worship of that time, that there were the outer courts and there was the Holy of Holies, and that Jesus himself has gone in. Now, for us who are disconnected from a Jewish context, we think, oh, that makes total sense. The high priest, once a year, during the Day of the Atonement, was the only person that would go into the Holy of Holies. Jesus has gone into the Holy of Holies. You've been trusting in a high priest. Now I'm going to ask you to trust in Jesus. And then here's the crazy idea. Jesus sits down in the Holy of Holies. Now, if you remember what's in the Holy of Holies, it's the Ark of the Covenant. It's the throne for God himself. And Jesus enters into a heavenly Holy of Holies, and he sits down. Let me read you a couple passages. Hebrews 1:3, author starts off, boom, with a bunch of mind-boggling things. Hebrews 1:3 says, he, Jesus, is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. And after making purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Jesus goes into the Holy of Holies and sits himself down. How do I know this anchor is sure? Because Jesus is sitting in the chair. The anchor is sure, the anchor is steadfast, and oh, by the way, the anchor is wrapped around Jesus and he is sitting down in the chair and no one is moving him. We hear a little bit later on in Hebrews 10, 12 through 14. It says, but when Jesus had offered for all time a single sacrifice of sin, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting for that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. Psalms 110, back to Melchizedek. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. We have an anchor that is sure, we have an anchor that is steadfast, and we have an anchor that is wrapped around an immovable object of Jesus who is behind the veil. But there's one more. Let me read the passage again to you one more time. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. A forerunner, it literally means someone who runs ahead. This was the advanced scout team that would go in before the army. The army's coming. Oh, trust me, the army's coming, but the scout is going ahead. Let me give you a perfect illustration of this. When my wife and I go out to eat at restaurants, none of y'all would do this. I know, so this is just personal confession time. And you see another couple or you see individuals who are walking into the restaurant, you know what you do. You pull up to the door and one of you hops out because you got to beat the other people. So I pull up to the restaurant. I let my wife hop out. My wife goes in, and my wife gets our name for a table. Because you know what? I'm coming. I'm coming, and I'm going to get my seat at the table. And it is guaranteed because my wife is the forerunner for me coming to get the seat at the table. Jesus says, oh, by the way, I am sure, I am steadfast. This anchor is wrapped around me, and I'm sitting in the chair. And oh, by the way, I got a seat for you at the table. I have a seat for you at the table. How do I know that? I read it in John 14, 1 through 3. He says, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and I will take you with myself. For where I am, you may be also. We have an anchor that is sure. We have an anchor that is steadfast. We have an anchor that is wrapped around an immovable object. And oh, by the way, Jesus has already made the table reservation for you and for me. How do we know this stuff is true? It's by faith. This whole passage is about security. Now, we live in a world that we think we're secure. We have bank accounts to make sure we have money in the bank. We can go to the grocery store and we can get food. We have our phones with us at all times, so we keep up with what's going on. We're connected. We have loved ones. We have friends. But going back to that ice storm, it was kind of freaky for about 5 days, wasn't it? I didn't have, for some of you, you didn't have power, didn't have water. I don't know if any of you ventured to a grocery store. There was squat on the shelves at a grocery store. And one little ice storm completely wrecked the delivery mechanisms of the United States of America, and we couldn't get the things that we needed. See, we think that we're secure, but we all stand on shaky ground sometimes, and we have to be reminded that there's an anchor that is not shaky. COVID. 18 months we've been dealing with COVID. We had the world all figured out, and now we're dealing with a disease, and we don't really know the answers to this disease yet after 18 months. We're smart enough, we can come up with these things. We've got technology, we've got researchers, we've got scientists and all these things, and we still haven't figured out COVID either. No matter where you stand on the political spectrum, no matter what side of the aisle, the government is a dumpster fire right now. And we're smart people, and we think we've got this figured out, but we stand on shaky ground. And I've watched friends who are pastors, I've watched congregations that have closed their doors during this time. There's strife in the congregations. It's been hard to be in church right now. Our systems are broken. Our organizations are broken. Our leaders are broken. Now, we know in our minds, I shouldn't trust in these things. I know in my mind, I shouldn't place my trust on if food's going to be at Tom Thumb or not. I shouldn't put trust on, was AT&T going to make sure I have my cell service? Whatever the case may be, we know we shouldn't be trusting those things, but we trust in all of these other things instead of trusting in the one thing that is sure and steadfast, that's wrapped around an immovable object, and where we already have a reserved seat at the table. And see, for us as leaders, and all of you are leaders, some of you are going to be pastors. Some of you are going to be missionaries. Some of you are going to be leaders in the arts. Some of you are going to be leaders in counseling. Some of you are going to be business leaders. You're going to be parents. All of you are leaders. And everybody's looking to you. And you know what? You feel kind of shaky at times too, because I know I do. And I think I have to be the anchor for everything. And our leaders fail. And I fail. I'm not as sure and steadfast as I think I am. I know many of you have been listening to a podcast that's been out, that's The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Incredible production value on these podcasts. One of the episodes doesn't deal with Mars Hill per se, but one of the episodes deals with an individual by the name of Joshua Harris. Now, for some of you in the room, you know his name, very familiar. For others of you in the room, you're like, I'm not really sure who that person is, but you maybe have heard of the book. So when he was 17 years old, he started writing. He started publishing in a magazine when he was 17. And by his early 20s, he had published a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye that sold over 1 million copies. At 23 years old, he got a call to move from Oregon and to go out to Maryland to become a pastoral intern at an extremely influential church that was part of a larger church planting network. And by the age of 30, he had been named the senior pastor of this church in Maryland. But then the ground started shaking under Joshua Harris. In 2012, there were some tensions that were happening in the church, tensions between some of the leadership and philosophy of church governance and those types of things. And people were looking at this young kid who was, young, had never gone to seminary, had never been formally trained, and asking him, what are you going to do about this? His mentor that he had traveled across the country to go and serve under was asked to leave the church planting organization and to leave the church that he was a part of. The anchors started getting a little shaky. Then there was accusations of sexual abuse back in the late 80s and early 90s. Joshua wasn't even on pastoral staff at that time. None of the pastors were on pastoral staff at that time. But the accusations had come up about sexual abuse that had taken place years earlier. And the church decided instead of going to the police, we're going to handle this as an internal matter. And then a civil lawsuit was filed. And it was excused because of the statute of limitations had taken place. But here's a young guy, he goes out and he pastors a church, and now my mentor has left. The organization I've been a part of is now getting shaky. There's tension in the church. People are questioning my leadership. And now people are saying, why didn't you speak up and say something about this situation about sexual abuse? In 2015, Joshua Harris said, I just need to step away for a while. He was 40 at the time. He'd been a pastor for 10 years at the church, still has had no formal seminary training, no formal training at all, and he just was overwhelmed with the pressure and the storm that was going around him. And he says, I need to take a break. This is what he said to the congregation that day when he resigned from being a pastor. He says, this is what I'm realizing. I need to hear clearly from Jesus for my purpose, for his purpose for me. Losing my mom a few years ago, turning 40 last year, it's been a gut check for me. I'm asking the question, what does it mean for me to be faithful to fulfill God's purpose for me in my generation with the remaining time I have in my life? I have many people over the years tell me what God's purpose for my life is. What I'm learning is that only Jesus can place a call on my life. I can't live someone else's plan for my life. I can't even live my plan for my life. I need to live Jesus' plan for my life. Now we hear that and we applaud, going, good for him. Take some time. The burdens are getting great. And so he goes back across country, goes and enrolls in seminary, and the ground just continues to get shaky. This book that he had written earlier as a teenager and in his early 20s, he was now starting to discover that people were getting hurt by the things that he had written. It had gotten to the point that he says, I am going to disavow myself from the book that made me famous, the book that I sold 1 million copies for, the book that influenced a generation of young adults in the ideas of dating. I'm going to disavow, and I'm going to ask the publisher to please pull the book. Someone who was a seminary student with him said, I'd like to make a documentary about you and about your thought process of you disavowing the book that you had written that had made you famous. And so he makes this documentary, and he travels around the country, and he's now coming face to face with people who had been hurt by his ministry, who had been hurt by his book. Incredibly humbling experience. But also for Joshua Harris, it was a very shaky experience. In 2018, he's posting all this on social media. And then in 2019, him and his wife Sharon announced that they were getting a divorce. Here's what he said in his social media post for that. He says, there's been significant changes that have taken place in both of us. And then just a few days later on Instagram, Joshua Harris, this golden boy of the young, restless, and reformed movement, somebody who had sold millions of books, somebody who spoke at conferences. Many of you maybe have even heard him speak. Here's what he posted on social media, on Instagram in 2019, literally just days after he had announced his divorce from his wife. I've undergone a massive shift in regard to my faith in Jesus. The popular phrase is deconstruction. The biblical phrase is falling away. By all the measurements that I have for defining a Christian, I am not a Christian. Many people tell me that there are different ways to practice the faith, and I want to remain open to this, but I am nowhere there now. So going back to the podcast, if you've listened to the episode where Joshua Harris is interviewed by Mike Cosper, who is the editor of this entity. And what I love about this episode, it's just Joshua Harris just bearing his soul, just talking about everything that he went through. I want to read what he has about halfway through the podcast, talking about all of this experience that he had gone through. He says, it really wasn't for me this theological question that came up that I couldn't reconcile it. It was really, I think, the outworking of the hurt that was there. Processing what we had experienced in this church was traumatic. The decisions that we made in trying to do what was right, causing us to lose all these relationships. Literally, if you weren't loyal to the leadership, then you were cut off. So the shift from being this sort of golden boy of Sovereign Grace and CJ's protege to being essentially blamed for things falling apart. It was like people were saying, if you had just stood up, if you had just rebuked the people for gossip and slander and told them to not read things on the internet and defended the leadership, we would have held the line. Step one for me was saying, I don't want to be a pastor anymore. That was huge to be able to admit that when so much of my identity was wrapped up in that. Step two was starting the process of listening to the people who had been hurt by my book and recognizing that even with good intentions, you can build something that is actually damaging to people. You can think you're loading up people with grace, but you're actually loading them down with man-made rules. Behind the scenes, there was a lot that was falling apart in my marriage. My wife and I ended up deciding to end our marriage. And when that was made public, again, a whole nother layer of my identity was being revealed and pulled away. And I think that my process of deconstruction was so wrapped up in those things. So much of what I gave myself to, so much of the people telling me what truth should have been to me, so much of that just fell apart that I just need to be at a place of saying that I need to step away from all of it. I don't want to be trying to justify, explain, defend anything. I need the space to be able to figure out what is real and what isn't real apart from all of that pressure. You know, sometimes people talk about deconstruction as if it's this beautiful, guided process of a Lego castle that you step by step take one Lego off at a time and you deconstruct it. I think some people might have that experience. My experience was that the circumstances came and stomped my Lego castle. My own failures and things fall apart and relationships being broken, and I am just like trying to pick up the pieces, and I don't want anybody telling me that I've got to build it back exactly the way that the castle was before. I'm just like, please leave me alone and let me try to figure some of these things out. Because the way that I've been living has not led to life. It has not led to expansion. It has not led to love. It has led to a narrower and narrower, controlling, fearful outlook. I know that doesn't represent all Christians, but it represented the brand of Christianity that completely shaped me for so long. That's Hebrews 6. You want to see a modern day illustration of Hebrews 6, that right there is Hebrews 6. When you're listening to the podcast, the second half of the podcast, the interviewer takes off his objective reporter hat and he becomes extremely pastoral with him, pleading him to come back to the truth of the good news of the grace of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And even at the very end of the podcast, the interviewer says to Joshua Harris, Jesus is not done with you yet. It's a hard listen. It's a tragic listen. Joshua Harris does not trust the anchor. He doesn't trust the anchor to hold him. I'm afraid that if I push too hard on the anchor is going to break. If I pull too hard on the anchor is going to break. And Jesus says, give me everything you've got. Take the plunge. Trust me with everything. See, I know for some of you in this room, because let me go and tell you, Joshua Harris was in seminary when he was dealing with this. And I know some of you in the room, some of you watching on screen, you're like, I'm done. I came here to Dallas Theological Seminary. I thought I could figure things out, and I'm done. My Lego castle is in shambles. You've been hurt, you've been abused, you've been falsely accused, you've been wronged, you've been misled, you've been abandoned by loved ones, you've been forgotten, you maybe have failed, you feel like you're at your end of your rope. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. You've got to preach that over and over again. Don't give up. Don't walk away from this place. Don't disengage with Jesus. The thing with Joshua Harris, I've got to get away from Jesus. No, you've got to lean into Jesus even more. I've got to lean into Jesus even more. Throw everything you've got at Jesus because he can take it. But let me talk to you as leaders for a second. Again, all of you are leaders. You're going to be pastors, you're going to be missionaries, you're going to be counselors, you're going to be artists, you're going to be parents, you're going to be in leadership and all these things. And everyone is going to look to you to have it together. Let me take the pressure off. You are not an anchor. Whew. Just take a breath with that. Because if you are the anchor, you're going to fail. I fail my daughter. I fail my wife. I have failed my church. I have failed in job here at Dallas Theological Seminary. And if my whole life is revolved on me making sure I hit a home run every time and be successful every time and have it together all the time, you're not meant to do that. So take the pressure off and always point people to the anchor that is sure, the anchor that is steadfast, the anchor that is tied around the immovable object, which is the throne room of God. Point people to Jesus. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul. Let's pray. Gracious Father, I pray for my brothers and sisters in this room. I pray for my brothers and sisters who are watching this online. Life is shaky. Faith is shaky. But Jesus, you are not shaky. And we cast everything on you because you can hold us. We cast everything on you because you can take everything. We cast everything on you because you truly are the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. And you've done this for us. May we lean in hard in faith. And we do pray these things in your name, Jesus, because of what you have done for us and in the mighty power of the Holy Spirit who empowers us. Amen. Let me leave you with, let me leave you with a blessing. I asked Joe, I said, can I do the hand thing? You know, because you're always like, can I walk out yet? Let me leave you with a blessing. At the very end of the book of Hebrews, our author says this. He says, now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, May he equip you with everything good that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight. Through Jesus Christ, to whom all glory belongs forever and ever. Amen. You're dismissed.